It was a beautiful summer evening. Paul was happy. No more exams. He had just finished college. Now he needed a job. He wanted to be a writer and work for a newspaper. It was hot in the house. So, he decided to go for a walk. He walked near the river and watched the water birds. Suddenly he saw a girl. She was standing alone, looking into the water. She was young, and very beautiful. She had long dark hair, and she was wearing a pretty white dress. Paul went up to her. "Hello," he greeted her. "What's your name?" "I'm Maria," she said, and she smiled at him. Paul and Maria talked for a long time. The sun went down. It was nearly dark. "I must go home," said Maria. Paul asked her, "Where do you live?" Maria pointed up, in the big white house on the hill. Paul told her that he lived in the little brown house near the market. They laughed and talked for a while. But Paul was sad. The house on the hill was big and important. He realized that Maria was rich, and he was poor. But he was in love. They would often meet near the river. Maria always wore beautiful clothes and looked lovely. Paul thought about Maria throughout the day. One evening, Paul told her, "Maria, I've written a poem about you." He took a paper from his pocket and read the poem. "I met her in the evening by the riverside. Her dress was creamy white, and her hair with ribbon tied. She turned and smiled at me, and I asked her for her name. Though I am young and poor, my love will stay the same." Maria turned to Paul. "You are wonderful, Paul," she said. "I love your poem." He took her hand in his and looked into her eyes. "I love you, Maria," he said. "Do you love me?" She smiled. "Yes, of course I love you," she said and stood up to go home. Paul was very happy. He told himself excitedly, "She loves me. Maria loves me." Paul went home to his little brown house. It was small and poor, but it was always clean and tidy. Paul lived alone with his mother. That evening, his mother watched him. There was something different about him. "What's happened, Paul?" she asked. "Why are you so happy?" Paul replied, "It's nothing, Mother." His mother smiled. She realized that he was in love. The next day, Paul and Maria met again by the river. Maria looked sad, but Paul did not observe this. He took her hand. "Maria," he said, "I am poor now, but one day I am going to be a famous writer." Maria said nothing. He continued, "Will you marry me, Maria? Say yes. We will be so happy." Maria looked at him for a moment. There were tears in her eyes. Slowly, she shook her head. Then she turned and ran away. "Maria!" he called out. But Maria had vanished into the dark. Paul walked home sadly. He did not understand Maria. What is wrong? He thought. She loves me, doesn't she? His mother was waiting for him. She saw his face. Poor boy, she thought. The girl doesn't love him. Paul and his mother ate their supper in silence. Suddenly somebody knocked on the door. Paul opened it. A man in a chauffeur's uniform stood outside. "I'm from the house on the hill," he said. "My mistress wants to see Paul." "That's me," said Paul. "Can you come with me now?" said the servant. "Yes," said Paul. He was excited. Perhaps Maria has changed her mind, he thought. Perhaps she does want to marry me. Paul's mother stood at the door of the house. She watched Paul and the servant leave together. "The house on the hill," she said to herself. "I know those people. A rich old woman, and her beautiful daughter. My poor son." It was not far to the house on the hill. The servant took Paul up the wide steps and into the house. Paul was excited and his heart was beating fast. Everything was rich and grand. There were beautiful carpets, pictures and mirrors. Paul saw his reflection in a mirror. He looked poor in these rich surroundings. The servant opened a door. Paul went inside. An old lady was sitting in a big chair. Maria stood behind her. The old woman's eyes were small and cold, and her mouth was thin and hard. Her old hands were covered with big rings. She looked proud and angry. Paul looked at the old woman, then at Maria. How could this cold woman be Maria's mother? He thought. The old woman said, "So you want to marry my daughter?" Her voice was hard. Paul looked at her bravely. "Yes," he said. "I love Maria and I want to marry her." The old woman laughed. "You? No money, no father, nothing. My daughter will never marry you." Paul said nothing. He looked at Maria. She did not look at him. "I am poor now," he said. "But one day I'll be a famous writer." The old woman laughed again. "No," she said. "My daughter is not for you. She is going to be married soon. You will never see her again." The old woman got up and left the room. Maria and Paul were alone. Paul looked at Maria, but she did not look at him. She stood still and did not say anything. Paul went up to her and put his arm round her. Maria moved away from him. "I'm sorry, Paul," said Maria. "My mother is right. I can't marry you. I don't want to be poor. I want money, and clothes, and a big car." "But you love me, Maria," said Paul. "And I love you." He did not understand her. He was angry. "Yes, I love you, Paul," said Maria. "But love isn't enough." She looked at him. Her face was sad. "I'm getting married in 2 weeks," she said. "Goodbye, Paul." "I'm sorry." Paul left the big house and ran down the hill to the river. He sat there for a long time. "Maria loves me. I know she loves me," he thought. "But she is marrying another man. She is marrying him for money. Maria is afraid of her cold mother." After a long time, Paul went home. There was a light in the window of the little house. The door was open. His mother was waiting for him. She looked at his face, then she put her arms round him. They are bad people, my son, she said. You must forget her. For many days, Paul did not see any of his friends. His mother was worried about him. He did not talk to her. He did not eat or sleep. He often went to the river and sat there alone. All the time he thought about Maria. One day, he saw a headline in the newspaper. Rich man's beautiful bride. There was a picture of Maria and her husband. She was wearing a long white dress and a diamond necklace. Her husband was old and fat. Paul turned the newspaper over angrily. There was an advertisement on the next page of the newspaper. Paul sat down and read it carefully. Write a story and win a prize. Our story competition offers a chance to young writers to win recognition and earn money. Stories can be on any theme but must not be longer than 1500 words. Send your entry to this newspaper before the end of the month. First prize $500. 10 other prizes of $50. This is my chance, he said to himself. I'll write the story of Paul and Maria. And I'll win the competition. She'll read our story, and she'll be sorry. Paul was very busy now. Every day he got up early and worked at his story. His mother watched him. She was pleased. He was eating his food again. He was talking and smiling. Sometimes Paul felt pleased with his story. It was a good story. At last, the story was finished. Paul read it to his mother. She was very happy. It's a good story, Paul, she said. It's very good. 2 weeks later, a letter came from the newspaper. Paul did not open it. He was too excited. He gave it to his mother. You read it for me, mother, he said. His mother opened the letter and read it. Read it yourself, she said, and gave it to him. She was laughing and crying at the same time. Paul read the letter. Dear sir, I am very happy to inform you that you have won the first prize in the story competition. If you would kindly call at this office on Thursday at 10 a.m., the manager will present you with your prize. Paul jumped up. He danced round the kitchen and waved the letter from the newspaper. I've won, he shouted. Mother, I've got the prize. I'll be a writer. We'll have some money at last. I'll buy you a new dress and some furniture for the house. He stopped. Will Maria see my story in the paper? He asked. His mother looked at him. She was not smiling now. Do you still love that girl, Paul? She asked. Yes, mother, said Paul, I'll always love her. On Thursday, Paul went to the newspaper office. The manager was very friendly. Your story is good, he said. Very good indeed. Here is the prize money. He gave Paul an envelope with $500. Paul could not believe his luck. He thanked the manager and started to go. Don't go, said the manager. I want to talk to you. Where are you working? Paul replied, I haven't got a job, sir. I want to be a writer. Good, said the manager. We need young man like you. Come and work on our newspaper. Paul was very surprised and happy at the same time. Paul loved his work at the newspaper. He worked hard, but he did not forget Maria. One day, a reporter came into the office. "Listen everybody," he said. "Here's a story for the paper. Do you remember that beautiful girl, Maria, and her rich husband? There was a photograph of the wedding in our paper. She ran away from her husband last week." Everybody in the office stopped talking. This was news. Paul sat still. He felt cold. Maria left her husband, he thought. They had married only a few months ago. The reporter was still talking. "The girl's mother died last week," he said. "She heard the news and the shock killed her. The mother was rich, wasn't she?" Somebody asked. "Oh yes, she was very rich," said the reporter. "Maria will have all her money, of course. And her husband gave her a lot of money, clothes, jewels, and a car. Maria is a very, very rich woman." "I don't like rich women," said another reporter. Paul butted in, "Maria is rich, but she is also gentle and kind. Do you know Maria?" The reporter asked. "Well," said the reporter, "somebody must go to her mother's funeral. We need to report it." "Why don't you go, Paul?" Paul went to the funeral the next day. It was a long way to the church, but he walked. He wanted to reflect. "Maria loved me," he thought. "But she married another man. She must have been afraid of her mother. But now, her mother is dead." Paul was at the church now. He saw a big crowd. It was a big funeral. There were many big, black cars outside the church. In the first one was the coffin. There were a lot of flowers on the coffin and on the roof of the car. Paul stood at the back of the crowd. He took out his pencil and paper. He wrote about the cars and the people. Then he saw Maria. She was wearing a black dress. She looked sad, but very beautiful. She was standing alone. The man next to Paul spoke. "That's the daughter," he said. "She's a bad woman. She left her husband and it killed her mother. Look at her. Nobody wants to speak to her." Paul said nothing. Poor Maria, he thought. Everybody went inside the church. The funeral began. After the funeral, Paul went home. His mother was smiling. "Good news, Paul," she said. "Do you remember your cousin, Elsa? She is coming to stay with us. She is 17 now, and very pretty. You will like her." "Yes, I remember Elsa," said Paul. He did not look pleased. His mother was disappointed. He is still thinking about Maria, she thought. Elsa will help him to forget. But Paul did not want to see Elsa. "I must see Maria," he said to himself. "I must talk to her." He went to the house on the hill. But the house looked empty. There were no curtains at the windows. There was a big notice on the gate. It said, "For sale." Paul looked over the gate. There was nobody in the garden. Everything was quiet. Paul pushed open the gate, and went up the steps to the house. It was very quiet. He pushed at the front door. It was closed. He walked round the house. There was a window open. Quickly, Paul climbed through the open window. He was excited and his heart was beating fast. He was in Maria's old home. There was no furniture in the room. There were no carpets and pictures. It was empty. Paul went from room to room. All the rooms were big, and they were all empty. Suddenly, Paul heard a noise. Somebody was inside the room. The door opened. Somebody was standing in the doorway. It was a woman. "Maria," said Paul. Maria said, "Paul, what are you doing here?" Paul replied, "I was looking for you. Why did you marry that man?" Maria explained, "I was unhappy here. I never went to parties, never went out. I wanted a good time and friends." "I understand," Paul said. "You were not afraid of your mother. You were tired of her. She was old, and you wanted a new life. But why did you leave your husband?" "My husband," said Maria, "that fat old man. He was stupid, Paul. He gave me money, he gave me jewels, a car, everything." She continued, "But he didn't like my friends. He likes old people. I like clever, young people, Paul. I like you. I liked your funny poems." Paul stood there stunned. "My funny poems," said Paul and stopped. Maria asked hopefully, "Do you still love me?" Paul answered, "You are married, Maria." Maria said quickly, "I want to be free. I want to go to parties and enjoy myself. Come with me, I have money now. We'll be happy together." "No," said Paul. "No, everything is over." Maria was angry. Her eyes were small and cold, and her mouth was thin and hard. She looked like her mother. "I'm sorry, Maria," he said. "I don't love you anymore. I loved you very much. But now everything is different. Goodbye, Maria." He looked at her for the last time. Paul left the house on the hill. He was free. "I was a fool," he thought. "Maria never loved me. She is beautiful, but she is hard and cold like her mother." Paul felt very happy. The door of his brown house was open. His mother was at home and she was talking to a very pretty girl. "Paul," she said, "this is your cousin Elsa." "Hello, Elsa," said Paul and smiled.